The chamber is stone, and the air in it does not move. A man sits bound to a chair whose arms have been fitted with screws, and a notary stands nearby with ink and parchment, ready to record whatever sound emerges. The inquisitor does not ask whether the accused poisoned the wells. He asks how. The question assumes the crime because the crime is necessary. Outside in the streets of the city, bodies are accumulating faster than they can be buried, and the smell has begun to rise from the riverbanks where the dead wait in stacks. The inquisitor needs a mechanism for this death that can be seen, touched, and punished. A bacterium cannot be put on trial. A Jew can. The screws tighten. The notary dips his pen. The confession that follows will describe meetings in cemeteries, powders purchased from shadowed figures, plots hatched in synagogues, details supplied not by memory, but by the architecture of the question itself. The system does not require truth. It requires a story with human agents, human intention, human guilt, because human guilt can be answered with human blood, and human blood restores the illusion that someone is in control. The parchment dries. The property of the condemned is inventory before the execution is even scheduled. The plague has not created this machinery. It has merely switched it on. To understand what is really happening, one must look past the bodies and into the systems that arranged them. Medieval Europe did not collapse because a bacterium arrived. It collapsed because every institution that claimed to govern, explain, protect, or sustain life had been designed for conditions that no longer existed, and the bacterium simply walked through doors that were already hanging open. The plague was a test, and the systems failed not because they were attacked, but because they were already broken in ways their own logic prevented them from seeing. Consider the feudal apparatus. It was not a social contract. It was a machine for the downward extraction of labor and surplus, refined over centuries until its operators mistook its complexity for permanence. The peasant was bound to the land by law, not merely by poverty. Serfdom required week work, specific days of unpaid labor on the lord's demesmes plus champad rents paid in kind from the peasant's own harvest, plus fees for permission to marry, to move, to grind grain, to inherit a holding. The system assumed an infinite supply of backs and hands. It had no protocol for scarcity, no structural mechanism for responding to a labor shortage, because its entire design philosophy rested on the opposite condition: surplus labor that could be continuously harvested. Lords did not manage estates. They extracted from them. When the Black Death removed between 30 and 60% of the agricultural workforce, the machines seized. Lords attempted to command the same services from fewer people, to enforce the same obligations on depleted villages, to insist that the legal architecture of serfdom could override demographic reality. It could not. By 1353, the income of English lords had contracted by 20%, not because the land had changed, but because the system could not compute a world in which the peasant had options. The feudal machine had been built to exploit abundance. It had no reverse gear. The medical system was equally sealed, though its walls were made of theory rather than law. Medieval medicine operated on Hippocratic Galenic principles that had hardened into orthodoxy over a millennium. Health was the balance of four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Disease was elemental corruption, an imbalance caused by miasma, noxious air, or planetary misalignment. Treatment proceeded by contraries: cold and dry remedies for hot and wet conditions, purging for excess, bloodletting for congestion. This was not merely a set of ideas. It was a closed epistemological loop, a self-referential system that validated itself through internal consistency rather than empirical result. The physician's authority derived from his mastery of this taxonomy, not from his ability to cure. When the plague arrived, the medical faculties at Montpellier and Paris faced a pathogen that transmitted through fleas, that caused septicemic infection, that killed within days regardless of the victim's humoral disposition. The greatest ancient authorities had no experience of comparable pestilence and thus no explanatory framework. For 3 generations, physicians struggled to reclassify the plague within existing taxonomies, attributing it to a planetary conjunction in Aquarius in 1345, to corrupted air, to divine will filtered through natural philosophy. The treatments they administered, bloodletting to reduce excess blood, purging to rebalance the body, were not merely useless. For patients already septicemic, they were actively harmful, accelerating death by further weakening the body's defenses. The system was theoretically bankrupt before the bacterium reached Europe, yet no alternative framework could emerge, because professional status, university credentials, and social standing were all embedded in Galenic orthodoxy. To admit the framework's failure would have been to destroy the basis of medical authority. So the physicians persisted, not out of malice but out of institutional gravity, their professional identities tethered to a model of reality that reality itself had already invalidated. The Church, too, was architecturally doomed by its own design. The Roman Catholic Church maintained a monopoly on salvation through physical sacraments that required clerical mediation, confession, last rites, the Eucharist. This design maximized clergy exposure to infection. Priests were required by their institutional role to attend the dying, to assemble with corpses, to perform funeral rites in close proximity to victims whose bodies were shedding the pathogen. The sacramental system literally killed its own operators. Clergy mortality reached 42 to 45%, exceeding even the general population's catastrophic rates. The Church had built a spiritual economy in which the intermediary was physically indispensable, and the plague turned that physical indispensability into a death sentence. As qualified clergy died, their positions were filled by unqualified individuals who purchased offices through simony, degrading the Church's operational capacity at the precise moment its authority was most needed. Pope Clement VI eventually granted remission of sin to all who died of plague and permitted confession to anyone present. Even women, the tacit admission that the sacramental infrastructure had collapsed, that the narrative of clerical indispensability was false, that the machine had run out of operators. The maritime trade system that delivered the plague to Europe was optimized for profit and cargo throughput, with no epidemiological imagination. The Genoese trading station at Kaffa on the Black Sea and the Silk Road maritime routes moved spices, silk, and porcelain through ports that functioned as transmission amplifiers. Black rats carrying Yersinia pestis-infested fleas traveled in the same holds as the cargo, disembarking at Messina, Marseille, Venice, cities whose urban density and non-existent waste management created optimal conditions for road and human contact. The port cities were not merely entry points. They were amplifiers, multiplying the vector through crowded streets where waste emptied into rivers, where the Thames and other urban waterways accumulated what contemporaries described as dung and lay stools and other filth. The infrastructure that sustained European commerce was dual use. It transported both prosperity and pathogens, and there was no mechanism to separate the two because no one had thought to build one. Trade was governed by the incentive to keep moving, to keep selling, to keep the tax revenues flowing. A port closure meant economic collapse, so the ports stayed open until the disease closed them by killing the merchants. But these systems did not fail in isolation. They failed in sequence, and the sequence began long before the first rat stepped onto a Genoese galley. Europe was already at its Malthusian limit. From 800 to 1300, population growth had been geometric, while agricultural production increased only arithmetically. By the early 14th century, the land could support its population only under optimal conditions. There was no surplus buffer for crop failure. Then the climate shifted. A period of cooler, wetter weather destroyed harvests for 7 years, from 1315 to 1322. The Great Famine that followed caused mass death, cannibalism, infanticide, and an 80% collapse in cattle and sheep populations due to the Great Bovine Pestilence. The European population was immunologically compromised and nutritionally depleted before the bacterium ever reached its shores. The plague did not strike a healthy civilization. It struck a civilization already starving, its biological substrate primed for high mortality. There were warnings, and they were ignored because the systems could not process them. The plague had been active in Central Asia since at least 1322. By 1343, it had infected the Mongol Golden Horde besieging Kaffa. Reports of mass mortality troubled the same trade routes as commodities. Yet European merchants and municipal authorities treated these as distant disturbances rather than existential threats. The disease vector was knowable. Merchants at Kaffa observed the siege army's collapse, but the information was not translated into port closure or trade suspension because the economic incentive structure prioritized commerce over risk assessment. The system was designed to move goods, not to evaluate threats. Information that could not be monetized could not be heard. Even the psychological template for responding to health crises had been established. In 1321, accusations of well poisoning swept France and Aragon, targeting lepers. Local officials promoted these allegations not because they believed them, but because they provided the mechanism for stripping lepers of political and economic privileges granted by the crown. The violence was institutionalized. It transformed invisible biological causality into visible human intention, making the crisis psychologically manageable and economically profitable through property confiscation. When the plague arrived, this bureaucratic precedent was already loaded into the system. The machinery of scapegoating did not need to be invented. It only needed to be aimed at new targets. The chain reaction, when it began, moved with the inevitability of water finding cracks in the foundation. Infected black rats entered Kaffa and other Black Sea ports through maritime trade, and the same ships that maintained the economic lifeline of Genoese and Venetian commerce became biological delivery systems. The plague reached Messina, then Marseille. Urban density, combined with sanitation collapse and abundant rat populations, enabled rapid flea-to-human transmission. Then the pneumonic form emerged, creating human-to-human airborne transmission that bypassed the flea vector entirely. The cities became incubators, each street a transmission line, each breath a potential infection. As the death toll mounted, the institutions began to decapitate themselves. Clergy died at accelerated rates because their role required mandatory contact with the infected during last rites and funerals. The death of qualified clergy created a vacuum filled by unqualified individuals who purchased positions through simony, degrading the church's operational capacity, precisely when its authority was most needed. The faithful watched their spiritual mediators die at the same rate as everyone else, and the promise of sacramental protection revealed itself as narrative without biological foundation. When the Church could not deliver physical protection or spiritual explanation, alternative authorities emerged. The flagellant movement spread from Hungary through Germany and France with the same velocity as the plague itself. Groups of penitents traveled town to town, performing public self-flagellation, administering last rites, preaching anti-clerical messages. They recruited hundreds daily across social classes. Their movement represented a psychological attempt to restore human agency through self-punishment. By identifying with the crucified Christ and performing public penance, participants believed they could preempt God's ultimate punishment, could negotiate with the divine through suffering. Pope Clement VI issued the bull In Terror Sollicitunes, condemning them, not because their methods were less effective than the Church's, for all methods were ineffective, but because they threatened the Church's narrative monopoly. The institution prioritized its own survival over the population's, suppressing alternatives rather than solving problems. Meanwhile, the economic inversion that would unravel feudalism was already underway. Labor scarcity inverted the feudal power relation with a speed that centuries of peasant resistance had never achieved. At Fornham All Saints, reaping wages rose 67% during the plague year. At Cruxon, a ploughman demanded 3 shillings in 1349 and 10 shillings in 1350, up from 2 shillings weekly before the death. Lords who attempted to enforce pre-plague labor obligations faced abandonment of holdings as peasants migrated to better terms. The Statute of Labourers in England, enacted in 1351, attempted to criminalize these wage increases, blaming peasants for economic disruption rather than acknowledging demographic reality. The law was not a solution. It was an institutional tantrum, a refusal to accept that the economics of scarcity had replaced the economics of surplus. The manorial system unraveled. Lords curtailed cultivated acreage by more than half on some estates, and shifted from grain agriculture to pastoralism, which required far less labor. Portable wealth in money and skills replaced land-based wealth. The Cru regions phenomenon emerged. Coastal and mountainous areas abandoned grain production and exported surplus labor as mercenaries and sailors, facilitating the later European expansion that would reshape the world. The plague had not merely killed workers. It had made labor valuable by making it scarce, revealing that power relations in extractive systems are maintained not by ideology or force alone, but by the underlying economics of resource availability. When the resource calculus shifts, ideology and force follow. As municipal and ecclesiastical systems failed to control the disease, authorities and mobs redirected violence toward Jews, lepers, foreigners, and mendicants. In Toulon, 40 Jews were killed and their houses pillaged on Palm Sunday, 1348. This was not random panic. It was a patterned institutional response. Accusations of well poisoning transformed invisible biological causality into visible human intention, making the crisis psychologically manageable and economically profitable through property confiscation. Jewish pogroms were frequently preceded by debt relationships between Christian borrowers and Jewish lenders. Royal correspondence in France ordered the arrest of Jews, interrogation under torture, execution of the convicted, and confiscation of property for the royal treasury. The violence was not spontaneous mob behavior, but an institutional mechanism for debt cancellation and asset seizure. When systems cannot solve problems, they redirect violence toward minorities to simulate control. The mechanism is consistent. Transform an intractable systemic problem into a tractable human enemy, then confiscate their assets to offset economic losses. The plague provided the cover, but the machinery was already built. The psychology of the survivors reveals how deeply the systems had colonized their minds. Even as mortality mounted, populations continued customary behaviors. Boccaccio observed that funeral rites, neighborly assemblies, and clerical gatherings proceeded according to tradition until the volume of corpses made them physically impossible. The maintenance of custom in the face of catastrophic data is a classic normalcy bias. The system of social habits persists until it is overwhelmed by reality. People continue to act as if the institutions would save them, because the alternative that the institutions were irrelevant was cognitively unbearable. The plague's cause was invisible and non-intentional, and humans under stress prefer intentional explanations to random ones, because intentional agents can be punished or negotiated with. The well-poisoning accusation transformed an incomprehensible biological event into a comprehensible human plot. It served both psychological relief and economic redistribution. When survival finally conflicted with institutional duty, the latter collapsed. Priests abandoned parishes, lords fled manors, physicians fled cities. The gap between institutional role and individual survival instinct revealed that feudal, medical, and ecclesiastical identities were performative rather than binding. The system had operated on the assumption that actors would prioritize role over self. The plague proved this assumption false. The physician who had defined himself through Galenic theory abandoned the city where his theories were being invalidated. The lord who claimed divine right to govern abandoned the manor he could no longer extract from. The priest who mediated salvation avoided the dying he was theoretically indispensable to. The theater collapsed, and the actors removed their costumes. The expert systems persisted in their orthodoxy not out of ignorance but out of institutional groupthink. Galenic physicians continued to attribute the plague to planetary conjunctions and miasma despite empirical failure, because their professional status, university credentials, and social standing were embedded in that framework. The medical faculty at Paris attributed the plague to a planetary conjunction in Aquarius in 1345. This was not merely ignorance. It was institutional defense, admitting the framework's failure would have destroyed the basis of their authority. The most dangerous moment in a crisis is institutional certainty, because certainty in the absence of understanding is not knowledge, but a defense mechanism that blocks learning. The Church was certain the plague was divine punishment. Medicine was certain about miasma and planetary conjunctions. The nobility was certain that labor obligations could be enforced by decree. None of these certainties permitted empirical investigation or adaptive behavior. Certainty became a cage. The aristocracy turned to astrology and miasma theory to explain the plague. The peasantry turned to divine wrath. Both were epistemological failures, but they served different psychological functions. Elite explanations preserved the illusion of intellectual control. Popular fatalism preserved the illusion of moral order. Neither permitted the observation that the bacterium was class-blind, that nobles and clergy and peasants died in the same streets, abandoned by the same frightened relatives. The biological democratization of death directly contradicted the theological justification for social stratification. The plague did not respect the boundaries that men had built between themselves. In the aftermath, the winners and losers traced the contours of the system's failure. Surviving peasantry saw wages rise 20 to 40% in the decades following the plague. Labor scarcity enabled negotiation of working conditions and conversion of labor services to cash rents. Municipal authorities and monarchs who sanctioned pogroms gained confiscated property and canceled debts. Cities that developed quarantine systems, Raguse's Trentino and Quarantino in 1377, Venice's lazarettos gained relative trade stability and competitive advantage through perceived safety. Though these measures were developed after the primary wave and served as much to restore social order and economic continuity as to block disease vectors, post-plague restructuring created crew regions that specialized in exporting mercenary soldiers and sailors, shifting from subsistence grain to martial and maritime labor markets. The landed nobility lost. Lord incomes contracted 20% by 1353, and the manorial system, dependent on labor surplus, became economically unviable. The Church lost its spiritual monopoly. The Lollard movement, Wycliffe's vernacular Bible translation, and anti-clerical sentiment gained traction because the Church had demonstrated its inability to protect or explain. Institutional medicine lost credibility. The failure of Galenic theory during the plague created the epistemological space for Paracelsian and chemical medicine to challenge university-trained physicians in subsequent centuries. The old god did not fall because it was attacked. It fell because it had been designed for a world that no longer existed. The deeper meaning of the catastrophe lies not in the death toll, but in what the death revealed. Medieval civilization had constructed an elaborate edifice of explanatory and governing systems: feudalism, Galenic medicine, sacramental theology that presented themselves as complete and permanent. The plague revealed that these were fragile narratives layered over biological and economic realities that none of the institutions could perceive, model, or control. The gap between institutional self-presentation and actual capacity was catastrophic. For 3 centuries, European institutions had built a self-referential validation system. Theology confirmed Aristotelian physics, which confirmed Galenic medicine, which confirmed social hierarchy, which confirmed theological order. The plague was external to this loop. It could not be absorbed, explained, or managed by the closed system. The result was not merely physical death, but epistemological collapse, the recognition that the dominant frameworks for understanding reality were inadequate. The construction of cathedrals, universities, and transcontinental trade routes had created an impression of civilizational permanence and upward trajectory. The plague demonstrated that complexity does not equal resilience, and that interconnectedness, the very feature that enabled economic prosperity, also enabled rapid systemic contagion. The Silk Road was a dual-use infrastructure. It transported both spices and pathogens, and there was no mechanism to separate the two because the system had never been designed to evaluate risk, only to maximize throughput. Systems optimized for extraction, status preservation, or narrative monopoly cannot pivot when reality contradicts their foundational assumptions. They double down on failure because their internal incentive structures reward orthodoxy maintenance, not empirical adaptation. The Church condemned flagellants not for medical reasons, but because they threatened institutional mediation. Lords resuscitated obsolete labor obligations because they could not imagine an alternative revenue model. Physicians defended humoral theory because their credentials depended on it. All these incentives aligned against the adaptive behaviors that might have reduced mortality: empirical medical investigation, decentralized spiritual practice, labor market flexibility, trade quarantine. The interaction of rodent ecology, flea biology, trade networks, human immune systems, urban sanitation, and social behavior produced emergent consequences that no medieval institution could predict or manage. This is a pre-modern instance of what complex systems theory identifies as nonlinear causality. Small initial conditions, a flea on a rat, in Kaffa generated civilization-scale outcomes through feedback loops that amplified rather than dampened the initial perturbation. The systems did not fail because they were attacked. They failed because they were designed to extract, to maintain orthodoxy, and to preserve hierarchy. And they possessed no adaptive capacity when reality exceeded their design specifications. And the machinery does not stay in history. It persists in the present tense of institutional behavior. Systems that extract without redundancy collapse when extraction targets become scarce, and they collapse with a violence that falls not on the architects but on the margins. Expertise systems that cannot admit ignorance or incorporate anomalous data become liabilities when conditions exceed their design parameters. Institutions still protect narrative monopoly before protecting constituents. Still redirect violence toward minorities when systemic failure demands a visible enemy. Still enforce obsolete obligations because they cannot imagine alternative revenue models. Still prefer the certainty of broken frameworks over the humility of not knowing. The closed loop still turns. The notary still waits with his pen. The screws still tighten. The confession still writes itself. The plague was never merely a disease. It was a stress test, and the systems that failed did not fail because they were unlucky. They failed because they were already broken, already blind, already committed to their own preservation above the reality they claimed to govern. The bacterium only walked through the door they had left open. The door is still open,